I'll begin this afternoon session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today is Tuesday, February 17th, 2026, and this is the fourth session in the e-lecture series entitled Applied Research Perspectives Across the Canadian Forest Service. The series is a collaborative effort coordinated between the Canadian Forest Service and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate and host these webinars. For today's session, we are pleased to welcome Chris Hennigar, Beth Brooks, and Mathieu Fortin, who will present a collaborative tree database for climate-sensitive growth modeling in Canada. To start us off, Chris Hennigar brings over 20 years of experience across the forest sector, including private consulting, collaborative research, and 10 years with the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources. He joined the Canadian Forest Service at Atlantic Forestry Centre in January 2025 and has been working toward the development of climate-sensitive forest growth and yield models for Canada. We're also joined by Beth Brooks. Beth has been a forest inventory analyst with the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources since 2023. She holds a Master's of Forestry and a Bachelor of Science in the Environmental and Natural Resources Management from the University of New Brunswick. She specializes in growth and yield modeling, spatial data analysis, process automation, and complex inventory projects. Last but not least, Mathieu Fortin is a research scientist in forest biometrics at the Laurentian Forestry Centre. He earned his PhD from Laval University and joined the Canadian Forest Service in 2019. His research focuses on stochastic growth models, upscaling techniques, and statistical estimation with a strong interest in implementing models into software. With that, I will now pass it over to Chris to begin today's e-lecture session.
Hi all, good to be with you. Can't see your faces, but hopefully there's a good amount of you here to see this today. So as Sharon summarized there, this is the third or fourth lecture now, talking about climate-sensitive growth and yield models. And today we're going to be talking about the data behind those models. So, and unless you've compiled these data before, you may not realize how much effort actually has to go into compiling some of the data for these models. And the bigger the scope, the bigger the data. So we've put a lot of effort over the past year into compiling data, specifically permanent sample plot data with the help of the MagPlot team. And it's really been a collaborative effort between provinces, territories, and the federal government. And I just want to talk a lot about that today. Just a little bit of background on this initiative. So back on January 27th, there was a strategic overview presentation given at the CIF webinar where Mathieu talked about a lot of these different initiatives we're doing in growth and yield. From tree rings that was presented last week by Juha and Liam. And 2 weeks ago, site productivity by Joanne, Jose, and Piotr. And an overview of some of the other modeling that we're doing, growth and yield models by Mathieu in the strategic overview. So I'm not going to talk too much about models today. I'm going to talk more about the data. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about some tangible examples of growth and yield models and climate sensitivity integration into those models. But for now, we're going to talk mostly about the data. And our main clients in this project are really the carbon accounting team and provinces and territories, but certainly the public as well. With that, I'll get into some of the key objectives for the growth and yield team, which I'm a part of, as well as Mathieu, Jessica, Liam, and Jose. So in terms of the growth and yield team, we've got three main key objectives here. So the first one being really we want to, as presented earlier, interface a lot of the existing models out there today, the existing provincial models, but also some of the process models where possible. We want to try to build a common platform that would allow researchers and the carbon accounting team and other folks that want to do more regional level analyses with a lot of these different models. It would be nice to be able to plug and play them a little bit. So that's one of the objectives, and we're well on our way with that. The other one over the next couple of years, really the next 3 years, is really to develop new climate-sensitive growth and yield models, new tree-level growth and survival and regeneration models that can be used to plug and play with existing models, potentially enhancing or modifying those existing models, or really generate entirely new growth and yield models to provide independent estimates. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the background of that data and some of the collaborations we've had. And really, this is an opportunity, I guess, for others to contact us and try to get involved. We certainly want to work with folks out there today in industry and in universities, not just the provinces, but certainly we have a focus towards working with the provinces. So just keep that in mind as I go through this. We want to be able to share our work along this process, along this road. Okay, so one of the major data sets that we're going to be using is the compiled PSP data that the MAG team, the multi-agency ground plot team, has put together over the past 3 or 4 years. So there was just a publication put out this year in CJFR on this effort, and this team out of the Pacific Forestry Center has compiled most of the provincial data sets across Canada into a common format. This data consists mostly of permanent sample plots, but also temporary sample plots, about 52,000 locations. There's a couple provinces that are still on the to-do list. So Newfoundland's very close for them. They're almost done that data set, and they still need to do Saskatchewan, but they have that data. And then we have a couple data sets missing and that we've noted and compiled in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And then kind of at the periphery, also, we have some other data sets that have been mentioned in some other previous presentations, the tree ring data set, as well as provenance trials across Canada, many of which have been compiled into tree source, as well as the tree ring data that Liam talked about last week. PSP data is good for developing growth and yield models. It's really the main source for developing growth and yield models. There are some challenges, as Liam mentioned last week, about using that data to infer climate tree ring tree survival responses, because the genetics of trees and the association of trees within different forest types and soils and site conditions change spatially. So that link between what we see in terms of tree growth in one climatic zone to another may be driven by other things other than climate. So having these additional data set layers here as kind of a straight face test to see whether or not our climate relationships coming from the PSP data are valid is really key. That's kind of what we started with back in the beginning of 2025. So when I came on, I was keen to grab some of the data from down in the US. So the US National Forest Inventory has a publicly available permanent sample plot database. It's downloadable and it's widely accessible. And so we standardized that into our database format. Mathieu and I did that work. And then we also started picking up data sets across Canada that the MagPlot team hadn't had a chance to compile yet or just didn't have access to at this point. So we, through some previous work that I had been doing for the Newfoundland government in developing some of their growth and yield models, I had already had access to that PSP data, so we included that here. And there was a couple key data sets in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia that were missing. One of the major ones was the New Brunswick permanent sample plot co-op network, measured from the 1980s to the about 2010-ish, and also the Nova Scotia research plot network. So we picked those data sets up, and we're actually working with the magplot team to get those data sets compiled into their next gen version of the magplot database. And then we also compiled and updated Quebec, and Quebec is publicly available through a website link. And we also updated Ontario and added an additional hardwood PSP data set that increased that PSP data set by about 20%. We also updated BC to the latest version. And just this morning, I finished Saskatchewan. So I'll be sharing that compilation with the magplot team as well. We're certainly not the data distributors. The magplot team is really out of the Pacific Forestry Center is really the spot to go to get the data. But we have a lot of experience in growth and yield and inventory data sets, so we're able to compile these data sets, pretty quickly, and then get them over to the magplot team to fill in some of these holes. So this is what the data looks like. We've compiled now almost 250,000 locations. We kind of cut it off halfway down the US because this is kind of the worst case climate temperature scenario for Canada. So we figured we'd cap it off there. And total tree records are around about 25 million now and counting, with about 68% of those trees in Canada. And in terms of growth and yield, I mean, all of that data is very useful. But in terms of developing growth models and survival models, we really need individual tree data that is measured over multiple time periods. And if we break the data down this way, about 50% of those locations have greater than 2 visits with tagged trees that are tracked individually through time to be able to monitor that growth and survival. And that boils down to about 5 million tagged trees with greater than 2 visits. So you can see over in the east, Nova Scotia has one of the longest running programs in all of North America. There's certainly longer running programs in BC and Petawawa, Ontario, but fewer plots, less consistency compared to Nova Scotia. Yeah, there's lots to talk about here on this slide, but I'll leave it there. We've been intersecting those locations with just a pile of climate variables, biosim and climate NA, over 70 variables. We've got climate ranging from the 1950s to present on monthly and annual timescales to be able to pull out the climate exactly between those different growth increments, those different growth periods at each of these locations. And so I want to kind of talk a little bit about the collaboration between us and the magplot team, because it is a little bit confusing. I mean, the magplot team has their data set that has been published online. You can go and you can download it. They've got a publication there. They are really the go-to source for the public data, and you can request through them access to other licensed data from the province through their portal. We're not really in the business of providing data, but we are in the business of using that data, and we want to help the magplot team along the way because we have shared interests here in both compiling data and using data. So we've been meeting bi-weekly for the past year. A lot of meetings, a lot of time, whole teams talking. When we meet with our whole team with these folks. And it's been a good collaboration over the past year in understanding the way they've formatted the data, the way they've processed it, and then they're understanding the way we're processing it. And we've got a bit of a different format that we're using. And they're on their road to version 2, and I don't know what the timeline is for that, but certainly they're looking to get that out soon. And we've been trying to inject some of our knowledge, specifically in the Maritimes, where I have a lot of knowledge about the different plot designs, and Mathieu in Quebec, to help the MAG team kind of increase the speed at which they uptake this data. There's literally thousands of different plot designs across Canada. It's really unreal. So having a database that can store that information and be very explicit about those data set designs is extremely important for others to be able to understand them. So that's what one of the things we're trying to improve upon is just the explicit nature of communicating those designs. And then we're also developing fairly efficient processing pipelines for each of these data sets in RSQL and sharing those on GitHub between team members, just in private repositories at this point. And also developing software. So we're developing cleaning software, outlier detection software, and the plan is also to share that software with the MagPlot team. Right now we actually have it to the point where we've got a common GitHub repository where the MagPlot team shares their compilation pipelines for their data sets, and we share ours. And we're actually to the point now where we can start doing quality control on those pipelines. So we've come a long way in the past year. And so I think the version 2 is kind of going to be a bit of a joint effort here in a way. One of the, I guess, background reasons why we've come up with a bit of a different format is that there's been a bit of a long history for me in compiling data sets. I started 10 years ago in the Acadian Forest region, compiling quite a few permanent sample plot data sets from Maine to Nova Scotia to PEI. And I was trying to come up with a very lightweight common format for those. And then I developed some commercial application at the time called PlotCop, and with the intent of cleaning that data. So that work was done to calibrate the open stand model in the Acadian Forest. Since joining with the Canadian Forest Service, we've did a lot more on trying to standardize that database format. So again, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but there's been a lot of iterations here where we've come across new data sets and we've had to adapt. I think we're at the point now where we've got a database design that is very flexible, it's lightweight, it's efficient, and it contains all the types of information that we need for fitting growth and yield models. So it's very much catered towards data that you would want and the structure that you would want for starting to fit growth and yield models. Probably the most important aspect in here is just that explicit declaration of sampling designs, dealing with nested sampling frames, clustered sampling frames. There's a lot of complexity out there. So, and then along the way, I've converted PlotComp over to an open source version, and that should be available sometime in the spring for testing. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to release that yet, but the idea is that the input format would be this version 5 database, and users would be able to run PlotComp on their permanent sample plot data as long as they've got it in that format, to be able to clean and output information that would make it more a little bit quicker to jump right into growth and yield modeling. So one of the challenges here is to expand the geographic range that PlotComp is calibrated for. So right now it only works for the Acadian Forest. So we've got to calibrate it a little bit more for West Coast species and really all the way across Canada, and think more about calibration across different regions. I'll be presenting PlotComp through the MagPlot webinar series, so in probably a month or month and a half. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can contact the MagPlot team and sign up with that webinar series. I want to talk a little bit about the database structure because I think there's some good lessons learned here in terms of building a database structure for this type of data that is flexible and works, is kind of future-proof for new designs that you may come up with, or maybe you already have a number of different plot designs out there that you want to harmonize. These are some lessons learned in that. So you can kind of think of the database broken down into the who, the program, and the provider, and where. So, tables that allow you to understand the spatial layout of the plots, the when, and the what. So, at a location, what are you exactly going to collect? So in the designs table, you can think of that as like the survey field manual. And the frames are the plots that you would collect within that sample. So for a fixed area plot design, let's call it, this would be a single design. And 4 different frames, one for large trees, one for saplings, maybe a few for regenerating trees. And then you might even have some trees that are measured outside of the plot, like site index trees that have no real sampling area or frame per se, but you need a way to track them in the database. They're assigned a separate frame. And there's also variable radius plot designs to think about, and also mixed designs. So in some cases, we see variable radius for large trees, and then we have fixed area for the smaller trees. And then there's the other complicating thing about this is that you've got these cases where you've got plots intersecting roads and lakes, and you need some way to adjust the area of those frames. So the database does handle that. As well as in variable radius plot designs, where we may need to weight individual trees close to the forest boundary a little bit higher to avoid bias. For example, in the mirage method or the walkthrough method, for those familiar with those techniques. So the database is able to handle that level of plot complexity, as well as this kind of hierarchical spatial arrangement of the plots on the landscape. So in this example, the yellow tables, blocks, locations, plots. Blocks can be kind of thought of as a forest or a stand or a treated control block, and you would have sampling locations within there with potential for clustered plot arrangements within those locations. And then your sampling frames would be overlaid on top of those visit locations. So for every visit in this design, you can actually, every visit, you can actually change designs. So, we do see that sometimes in these inventory data sets where for whatever reason, the field manual changes and we're now collecting a different size frame or, other attributes of the field procedures change, and we need some way of communicating that to the folks that are using this type of data. So sampling designs are tracked by visit and trees are tracked by frames. We're using an SQLite database format. You could use Postgres, you could use SQL Server. The format of the database isn't super important, but SQLite is certainly a nice one to use. It's probably the arrangement of the tables that is the most useful here to communicate. So we've got our data sets, we've got our blocks, locations, plots, and treatments that are occurring at these plots. You can see the designs tables and the frames tables to explicitly lay out the sampling design of those plots. And the designs, again, are linked to the visits and the frames are linked to the trees. So with this framework, we can calculate tree expansion factors right off the designs, which is not something I see in most inventory data sets. It's not often possible to have enough information in the data set to actually be able to do that. So that's one of the defining features here. We spent a lot of time on lookup tables. We've got over 100 core species in Canada with over 500 observations. 200 if you count the US, kind of the northern affinity species, and 650 if we include the southern US and also rare species. So these lookup tables, they definitely took a bit to compile, and the MAG team also helped out quite a bit with that. So we've got a few stored queries to do example tree factor and basal area calculations, and a lot of indices and foreign key checks to ensure database integrity and high performance. So we're kind of, I'd say we're ready to pretty well close the book a little bit on the data compilation. We're ready to hand it over to the MagPlot team on anything that we've contributed, and I've talked a little bit about that. I also want to talk a little bit about handing that over to the provinces too, and I think that there's some great stuff that we've learned along the way that we can share with the provinces and others. So we're at the point now where we're trying to develop this plot comp app. We are actually starting to develop some tree height models, static height models. And by spring 2026, we're hoping to start really launching. We're hoping to really start, tree growth increment modeling and survival modeling. We still have a bit of information to collect on soils, topography, drainage, and management at these plot locations, but we're very close to being able to start modeling. And just another plug here that we're really wanting to share as we go here. We don't really want to just publish a paper at the end of this. We want to be sharing the code that we're using, the data where possible through the MagPlot team, and everything we're doing on a continual basis. So just as an example of that, and Beth is going to talk a little bit about this for New Brunswick, but as over the past year, we've really been just extracting data from the province, and we want to kind of give back a little bit. We think that there's some good lessons learned in these databases that we've developed, these pipelines, code for calculating climate at all of these locations through Biosim, this data cleaning software, plot comp. So now we're trying to develop actually GitHub repositories with the provinces to provide all of this information, provide the code, provide the data, and really try to do a little bit of outreach around that. And Beth is going to talk about that for New Brunswick. It was really a success story here where we did this for New Brunswick. We started it back in August, and we've compiled now 3 additional data sets through that work, and they've now harmonized all of their data sets into this growth and yield database format. And just last week, I was talking with Nova Scotia on trying to set up something similar for their data sets. So we're certainly keen to share where possible, and I encourage other provinces, if you're listening, to reach out. We'd be very much willing to share what we've done for your province. So with that, I'll hand it over to Beth.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. As Chris mentioned, I'm going to be discussing a little bit more of the experiential side of things. I'm going to be talking about how we handled this collaboration here in New Brunswick and the benefits that we've gained and are expecting to gain later on in the future. So we can just get right into it, talking about the data sets. So next slide. Thank you. So I'll just give an overview of the data sets that we're working with here in New Brunswick that were standardized as a part of this project. So in the bottom left, we're going to begin with the Forest Development Survey. This is a TSP program. It began in 1980 and ran until 2012. It's a network that consists of 35,000 stand timber cruises And it can be broken down into campaigns, distinct in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s. Moving on, we also were running concurrently through most of that time, from 1985 to 2014, was the Cooperative Permanent Sampling Program. So this sampling program was cooperative with industry and included 3,500 plots spread out across the province. However, most of those were located on Crown land. The Co-op PSP sampling program included 44 different designs when it was active, when you account for differing sampling methods for partial cuts, plantations, pre-commercial thins, and naturally regenerating stands. So quite a number of changes throughout the lifespan of the Co-op PSP program. The FDS and the Co-op PSP program were eventually replaced by the Continuous Landscape Inventory Program, or the CLI, in 2016. The CLI program is still active today and is considered our main forest inventory program. It consists of 15,000 forest land plots that are spread out across the province on a 2-kilometer grid. It incorporates crown land, industrial freehold, and small private woodlots, and is a fair, unbiased representation of the forest land in New Brunswick. Each plot consists of a fixed area, circular small tree plot with a radius of 3.99 meters or 50 meters squared in total area. And it measures the living and dead stems greater than 1 centimeter and less than 7.1 centimeters. Included as well is the large tree plots. So these are fixed area circular radius plots of 11.28 meters in radius or 400 meters squared. It measures living and dead trees greater than or equal to 7.1 centimeters. In addition, we also have a variable radius plot sweep that we use to pick up height trees using a 2-meter BAF. In the CLI dataset, a quarter of the plots were randomly designated as permanent sample plots, where individual trees are tagged so their growth can be tracked over time. The remaining 3/4 of the CLI plot network are designated as temporary sample plots. The location remains the same, but individual trees aren't tagged. Plots are remeasured every 5 years on Crown land and 10 years on other land ownership types. And as of this past January, so about a month ago, we have right around 14,500 plots collected, and including 1 million individual tree records. So it's quite the healthy data set there. I'd also like to talk about the Managed Stand Survey. This program also began in 2016 and took over aspects of the FDS survey that focused on sampling young, early stands. The Managed Stand is a TSP program, and it looks at stand development around the 10-15-year mark, sampling plantations, pre-commercial thins, and naturally regenerating stands. It was intended to monitor the free-to-grow status and construct young stand yield curves, as well as develop post-harvest succession models. At this point, there are 9 different sampling program designs when you account for differences in sampling plantations, pre-commercial thins, and natural regen. So all in all, throughout the 4 different sampling programs that we're looking at, there's a lot of different designs that we have to account for. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we're accounting for these differences in sampling program designs and working on this standardized database program, we used GitHub. So as Chris mentioned earlier, we officially started work on standardizing the New Brunswick datasets on August 28th, and we used a GitHub repository, a private GitHub repository, to work back and forth on our scripts that were used to convert the access databases, which is how our data is stored raw as the input to the standardized database. And so we worked on R scripts to convert those access databases into an SQLite database, and then SQL scripts to convert those raw SQLite databases into the standardized format. There's been a lot of work that Chris and I have put into this, and a lot of collaboration that's gone into this. So in total, I think we had easily over 15, I would say perhaps even 20 hours of meetings just between the two of us. And initially, a lot of our meetings were recorded so that we could go back and take a look at some of the discussions we were having and do some troubleshooting live. But as the program matured, and when I say program, I mean project, as the project matured and kind of in the later stages, we didn't need to record those meetings as often. For each data set, there are two main scripts that I mentioned. There's the R script that converts it into an Access database, into the SQLite, and then there's the conversion from the SQLite into the standardized. For me personally, GitHub was new. I had never worked with GitHub before the start of this project, but I'm converted. I quite enjoy working with it. So one of the cool features of GitHub and working with scripts in GitHub is that you're able to easily track changes. And if you look at the image on the screen right there, I've got a change tracked there that I made. So I changed the distinct 6 to a distinct 7. And those are the kinds of things that you can look for and watch as you're collaborating on these scripts. It's excellent. It's really great. Next slide. As a part of that private New Brunswick repository that we've been using to collaborate on the standardized database project, we've included a lot of really important key information. As an example, you can see here we've got a description of the project, what it is, what it started, really basic kind of README information that's going to be useful as people come in to collaborate in order to get up to speed. A lot of this information is stored within the scripts themselves, but that can be hard to find and hard to pull out depending on the situation. So it's much easier to have it duplicated and stored in the repository as well. And we've actually seen a lot of major success in storing this information in the GitHub repository. I've been able to invite other people from the New Brunswick DNR who are less familiar with the standardized database project into this repository, and they can really easily see exactly what I've been working on during this project. And they can easily get up to speed without too much interaction and hand-holding, which is excellent. Next slide. There is some important information, like I mentioned, just stored within the repository itself, just as an easy read. A lot of this information is redundant. So as an example, Chris mentioned earlier, there's the data sets are stored as part of the hierarchical storage. So we have those within the database itself, but we also have them in the repository. I want to note, though, that despite the fact that we have the description of the data sets in the repository, we're not storing the actual data itself in the repository. The only information stored in the GitHub repository are the scripts that we use to convert the inputs into the standardized database. So this isn't like a file transfer situation. It's just a standardized script repository. Next slide. So I've already talked about some of the benefits, but I'll move on and get a little bit more specific. So obviously we do stand to benefit from the widespread adoption of a single standardized database format. We do here in New Brunswick occasionally use plots from other jurisdictions like Maine and Nova Scotia, but we're limited in how frequently we can update those data sets due to the amount of work that it takes to manually convert them into a format that matches our own and is usable. And on top of that, even once we do convert them, there can still be some uncertainties about what exactly each program design entails and definitions, for example. So having a single scripted standardized database that's a natural solution to this problem, it saves a significant amount of time and a lot of confusion in the long run. And it makes it easier for us to collaborate with individuals in areas like Nova Scotia without necessarily even involving the federal growth and yield team. We also stand to benefit from the climate models that will be developed as a result of this program. Here in New Brunswick, we're a pretty small shop. There's only 4 of us, and we don't really have the resources to develop climate models that would be of a comparable caliber to the models that are going to be generated by the federal growth and yield team, especially considering the fact that they're going to be using data sets from across the country. So I'm looking forward to being able to lean on the expertise of this team for support in implementing any new climate models that they're developing in the future and improving that collaboration going forward. So another area we've seen improvement as a result of this collaboration has been in sampling program design itself, like within the CLI program. By going through the process of standardizing the CLI database, for example, into a format that has been developed to account for more mature PSP programs, like those in Nova Scotia and BC, like Chris mentioned. By going through that process, we've discovered some issues and identified some problems that we need to fix in our PSP program to make sure it's valuable moving forward. This is particularly timely for us here in New Brunswick because the CLI program is entering its 10th year, and there's going to be a big focus on plot remeasurement rather than establishment. As I mentioned earlier, there's 15,000 CLI forest land plots, and we've measured 14,500 of them. Some of those measurements are remeasurements, but for the most part, we're looking at moving into remeasurement rather than establishment. And as a result, previously, there hasn't been much of an opportunity for us to use our individually tagged trees in any kind of growth or survivorship models because we've had a low number of remeasurements. Just to give you an example of the kind of issues we've been able to identify, some field sampling crews during PSP remeasurement would remove previously installed tags on small trees and then reassign a new tag number when that tree graduated from the STP to the LTP, which happens when the DBH increases past 7.1 centimeters. This is a huge problem, as I'm sure you can understand, especially with a PSP program, because it looks like that small tree disappeared and then a large tree appeared in its place, and tracking those kinds of changes can be really challenging. So this is an example of an issue that we found through this standardization work and through collaboration that we've been able to then identify and discuss and find potential solutions for. It's going to improve our sampling program in the long run. Part of this to consider too is that it would be a lot of legwork on my end in order to go to each individual province and talk to everyone I need to talk to in order to gain the information and experience that is inherent to a standardized database format that's been developed for everyone. It saves me a lot of time, and it's a great method of doing this. And now, through the benefits of this collaboration, we can work towards ensuring that the data that we're collecting will actually be useful for the kinds of models we need to develop both now and in the future, in 20, 30, 40 years down the line. Okay, next slide. One of the last benefits I want to talk about is the conversion into SQL. So personally, one of the big benefits or changes that we've seen has been as a result of transitioning into an SQLite database format. The best parts of this are the ability to leave comments directly within the SQL standardization script. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these comments are included in the GitHub repository itself, so you don't necessarily have to pick through the script to find them, but a lot of the little nitty-gritty things you can now include within the standardization code. As an example, I've got a little note here that talks about how plot 14 in these treatment IDs are missing coordinates. And that's just a nice little piece of information to share with anyone who's perhaps less familiar with the data set, or could be wondering why they're seeing a specific error. Working with the SQLite code and having a standardized automated script has been able to save me massive amounts of time. Before, on my own end, when I would get new CLI plot information, it would take me 3 to 5 days in order to take that raw information, fix it, clean it, and turn it into a formatted version that we can use in growth and yield models. This version, this standardization, happens in less than 2 minutes. It's excellent, it's much quicker, and I know exactly what's going to happen. And I can tell someone exactly what's going to happen because they can see it. You know, with the Access database, it's a little bit more amorphous. They'd have to dig through, I think it's 63 different queries that I use to produce a final product. So I've been really enjoying the SQLite conversion side of things. Before I end off, though, I just want to emphasize that while we've had major successes working with GitHub and working with SQL here in New Brunswick as a part of this collaboration project, the biggest benefits here aren't necessarily GitHub and SQL. The part that I would like people to take away is that this project is really valuable. It will be useful for many, many different user groups over a long period of time, and it relies on enthusiastic and active collaboration. The benefit here really is the process of digging into your data sets, standardizing them, getting familiar with them, and then opening up yourself for experience from others into your survey program. So biggest takeaways here, massive benefits for collaboration, and the process itself is been very, very valuable. And that's where I'll finish off and hand it back to Chris.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I want to leave time for questions, so I won't dwell too much on these takeaway slides. But just in summary, we're looking at developing a lot of models over the next 3 years, and we'd like to hear from you and understand best how best we could collaborate. Over the next year or so, we hope to have a new version of the MagPlot database, and I think that there's a lot of good opportunities there for collaboration. So with that, I'll hand it back to Sharon.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, Beth, and Matthew. That was a great presentation. Now let's move on to the Q&A session. There is already one question in the Q&A pod. So I'll read it out. Is there an opportunity to use collected tree data from the database, aggregate with very high rigor with data collected from remote sensing to help AI models better identify tree species and other characteristics in remote sensing? For example, individual tree inventories. Does the data model link to the other remote sensing data?
Okay, I'll answer that in 2 different ways. So there are a large number of plots within our data set that we've compiled from the provinces that have survey grade coordinates. For example, the New Brunswick Continuous Land Inventory Program has mostly all survey grade coordinates that is used regularly for developing these types of remotely sensed models, particularly LiDAR models. So, access to those coordinates and those plots typically has to happen through the provinces. You'd really want to make sure that you were using the correct coordinates. On the modeling end of that question, we certainly see an opportunity to start building in more capabilities within the growth and yield framework for using remotely sensed and LiDAR-based information. So the presentation that was given by Joanne and her team on site productivity 2 weeks ago, talking about how we can now derive kind of a pseudo site index from multi-temporal LiDAR captures. We're certainly keen to try to figure out how to use that type of information to localize the calibration of some of these models that we're developing. And so over the next 3 years, we'll be taking a hard look at that. Hopefully that answers that question. I'm not sure if I got it exactly as intended, but.
Thank you, Chris. Moving on to the next question. As you have worked with the tree data and building the data set, what novel or innovative uses have you contemplated or thought of for the tree library?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can use this data for so many different things. So I mean, we're probably just going to start thinking about that. I mean, there's just tons of stuff you can use it for growth and yield, but I'm sure there's a lot of other uses you could use this data for, from inventory to habitat modeling to they've got a lot of deadwood snags in the data that could be used for habitat modeling and snag fall modeling that we're not particularly focused on right now we're more focused on just understanding how trees grow. So no, there's just tons of applications for this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Chris. Next question for you is, one of the main challenges working with inventory data across Canada is how different the designs are. For example, differences in plot size and block versus plot level designs. How are you dealing with this in the growth and yield modeling?
Right. So yeah, and that's partly why we've put so much effort into trying to make the database extremely explicit around the spatial arrangement of the plots. So, there may be spatial autocorrelation in clustered plot designs, plots that were collected from the same stand. There's all those things to think about. And then you've got quite a bit of variation in the plot sizes as well. And how does that impact the growth model? Is there some effect of plot size in the way basal area is calculated, or basal area of larger trees, or other competitive measures? So that's certainly on our mind. And because we've got so much data, I mean, the benefit here is that we can throw some out. So if some is just, the plot sizes are just way too small, we can potentially throw some of that out. And focus on more common designs that are less confounding. But yeah, certainly that's the main reason why we've put so much effort into understanding these designs.
Thank you, Chris. Next question for you is, in some versions of the Magplot database, I believe locations were made a bit fuzzy to limit ability to access plots. This affects getting climate data from BioSim and Climate NA. Are actual locations used in your final data set?
Yeah, so where possible, we try to grab the exact locations. And sometimes we have to enter into external agreements outside of the MAG team with provinces to get those exact coordinates. And so, where possible, we try to get those exact coordinates. And if we can't get the exact coordinates, then we try to get at least the exact elevation, or a very close proximity to the elevation. Because if we have a general idea of where the plot is, plus or minus a few hundred meters, but we have good information on the elevation, well, we can put that elevation into BioSim and get the right, at least, elevation back from that model. So the US data is a bit of a problem for us in that sense, because all of their plot coordinates are fuzzed, but they do report pretty accurate elevations on all of their plots. So we think that we're getting pretty close to the right climate for those plots. So yeah, that's definitely a consideration for sure. And the MAG team does fuzz some of their coordinates, and the provinces do have every province has a different rule around fuzzing those coordinates. So you need to be aware of that when using the MagPlot data.
Thank you. Next question is, another challenge with harmonizing data across province is the differences in land ownership. In some provinces, there is more province Crown-owned data, while other provinces have a lot of private ownership. How are you navigating obtaining recent data and integrating all data where there is variable goals, often due to differences in land ownership?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly there's a few key industrial data sets out there that we'd like to grab, where we may have holes in some of the PSP data. For example, in New Brunswick, there's large freehold tracts that are mostly managed, and a lot of the data collected in those tracts are from industry. So, not having those tracts of land and those PSPs from those tracts, there may be differences in management on those areas that would be useful to know, and different growth rates, different genetic stock, and so on that is occurring on those areas that would be useful to know. So we're certainly trying to gather that information from the different ownerships. We're starting big with the provinces. We're getting as much as we can there. We're a little bit less sensitive than, say, a group that is trying to develop an unbiased inventory estimate for, say, New Brunswick or BC. We can have a little bit more bias in the locations because ultimately we're trying to do a good job growing certain forest types. We're not really focused on getting the exact right inventory estimate, which you'd have to really get an accurate, unbiased sample from the jurisdiction across all ownerships in order to do that. But for growth and yield modeling, there's maybe a little bit less variation and a little bit less emphasis on getting an unbiased selection of plots, as long as you're making sure that within forest types, your models are unbiased.
Thank you, Chris. Another question for you here. What are the biggest gaps or differences you have seen that has caused data to be excluded from the data set? What new data should be collected during remeasurement to support historic measurements?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I could probably talk a long time about that one. One of the things that is difficult for us is when the plot design changes. So, when all of a sudden the area of the plot gets bigger or smaller, all of a sudden you've got more trees or less trees. The basal area calculation between the first visit and the second visit is now different just because the sample design is different. So, how do you deal with that? And often what ends up happening is that we've got to maybe not consider that growth increment within that visit in certain situations. It doesn't always, and it may not be a huge change in the design. It may be a subtle change, like just changing the sapling plot. So we might have to throw out some of the sapling data if those design methods change from visit to visit. It depends on the data set. If we see prolific issues like that, then we may try to deal with it. But if it's just one or two plots that have that issue, then maybe we'll just throw those plots out.
Thank you, Chris. One last question for you is, what is your vision of the final product? Is it going to serve similar purposes like FIA? What is the relationship to an FI?
Yeah, well, I think that's going to evolve over the next 3 years with the MAG team in concert with all of this. Certainly, the model down in the US is a nice one. You can just go on their website and download all the data very easily. Not a lot of licensing to go through or anything like that. Each province in Canada, because inventory is done at the provincial level, every province has a different way of doing it. So, it's going to be different in Canada. But certainly having this large database of plots and designs is going to be beneficial. Like maybe there's a few different formats we can provide the data in. Maybe it's not just the magplot format, but maybe we can provide the magplot team with our format for different uses, syncing up with PlotComp. So yeah, I don't have a super clear answer for that, but I can see it evolving, and I like the model in the US. So yeah, we'll see where that goes, I guess. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the provinces and territories, I think, because they've really got the mandate for this. We're just trying to help compile the information so that more people can use it.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for answering the questions. If there are no more questions, now I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Chris, Beth, and Mathieu for the great presentation. Bye, everyone.